Grace and peace to you in the blessed name of the Holy Trinity. Welcome to another segment of Reflections, which is presented by the Celtic Carmelite Wisdom Mission and Monastic Community. We're glad you've joined us today. We're going to be thinking about the question, what if God is beyond description? What if God is beyond description? As we think about that, we're going to look at a lot of different areas to see if we can make sense out of that question. Probably most of us at one point or another in our lives have asked the question, is there a God? If there is, who is he or she? What is God like? What does he do? What does he expect of me? Those questions are very similar across all kinds of cultures. They're not unique to us here in the United States. All peoples think about those in one form or another. I know I've looked at all of those questions during my lifetime to ponder them and explore different answers to those questions, as I'm sure many of you have as well. As we think about that, let us think for a moment about how we might answer those questions. How would we describe God? How would we begin to think about God? I know early on for me, I grew up in a rural Methodist church in which the primary method of teaching and preaching was one in the common vernacular of hellstone, of fire and brimstone, kind of the fear of hell situation. And that was my view of God for quite a while. It was a common view and has been in many cultures, in many periods of time. Certainly the most famous example of that is probably in colonial America in the era of the Puritans, when a minister by the name of Jonathan Edwards preached a famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. What a frightening thought. He depicted that as a great chasm, and we as humans were dangling from a tiny rope across that chasm. And at the moment, as he described it, at any moment, God might break that rope and let us fall into the fires. And God was seen by many people for long periods of time in that way. I sort of grew up, maybe not quite that severe, but certainly thinking of God in that way. As time went along, I moved to another view because I began to see that I needed to change that view. That was no longer an acceptable way of viewing God for me. As I did that, I started noticing that I would change a lot of things in those views. The next view for me was one of learning about God. I thought that if I wanted to know God, I needed to understand as much as possible about God. And so I spent hours and hours and hours of reading, study, in classes, in academic settings, seminary and graduate school, and just in my personal life, looking at how can I better understand God. You may have experienced that too. But as the years went by, I noticed again that I was changing those views more and more and more. Looking for God in different ways, trying to understand more about God. But that sort of puts God in a box. It makes God an object. As I attempted to understand it, as though I could put God in a laboratory and pull out a microscope and begin to explore God and to understand God. Let's use a couple of illustrations for a moment. How many of you watching this segment have ever seen a dinosaur? Obviously, no one living today has actually seen a living dinosaur. And yet we have pictures of dinosaurs, we have descriptions of them. All of these have been manufactured by archaeologists in their studies. It's always fascinating to me, not being an archaeologist, that those scientists can find fragments of bones and reconstruct the entire body of a dinosaur. And yet for most of us, that doesn't really line up really well. How can we really do that from fragments of bones? What we're doing is creating an object which meets our expectation and our image of what a dinosaur looks like. Let's put it in another illustration. One of my favorite professors used this illustration one time. I've used it many times since then. He asked the question, if someone asks you to think of a polygon, a multifaceted, multi-sided geometric figure, and then he said, draw that figure. And then he said, I'd like for you to draw a parallelogram. And then I'd like for you to draw a rectangle. Then I'd like for you to draw a square. Notice as we go through from the polygon to the square that we're growing more and more and more specific. In our understanding of God, that's what most of us have attempted to do, is to move from a more flexible illustration of God to trying to understand God in great specificity. And yet, God is existing more in that realm of the polygon, a multi-sided figure that can be all sorts of things. As we think about God, we're trying to do something with God that's really impossible. Father Anthony de Mello, a Roman Catholic theologian, stated that attempting to understand God and describe God is attempting to understand and describe the unknown, because we don't really know God. God is a great mystery. He said, and we take the descriptions, which are usually intended to be symbolic or poetic, descriptive, illustrative, and we make them into literal truth. That's a dangerous step for all of us as we've attempted to describe God. As we begin to look at that, we begin to understand that God is far, far, far beyond that. Let's look at a couple of illustrations. Maybe we need to think about using a different name. God has become such a common word in our culture that perhaps it's really lost its meaning for us. It's used in all kinds of ways. We even have acronyms now, OMG, for oh my God, and all kinds of things, how we use that even in profanity, words that most of us would be a little bit reluctant to use. And so maybe we need to think about different terms or different ways to describe God. We need to remember that in the Hebrew culture, the use of the name of God was prohibited. It was considered improper, and even further, it was considered sinful for anyone to utter the actual name of God. One of the more common names in that day was the name Yahweh. Most of us have heard that in one place or another, Y-A-H-W-E-H. And yet in the Hebrew culture, they used an acronym, a tetragrammaton, to describe YHWH. And those letters and those words, or the word Yahweh, actually means to be, to exist, to become. Now notice what's happening. Instead of speaking in specificity, God is in the process of becoming. He's being and he's existing. We find that in an illustration, and actually in two illustrations. One in the book of Exodus in the Old Testament, in chapter 3. Many of us have heard the story of Moses at the burning bush. God tells Moses to go release the people from Israel, lead them out of captivity into the promised land. And Moses is extremely reluctant to do this. He tries to reason with God. One of his statements is, or questions, well, Who do I tell them sent me? And God says, tell them, I am sent you. I am sent you. We move down a verse. God says, I am is my eternal name. That is my name, which must be remembered throughout all generations. So now we have a name which is connected to this idea of being. I am. I exist. I am a being. But he doesn't define it. He doesn't say, I'm a square. I'm a rectangle. But I simply exist. I am being. Now we begin thinking about that. Let's move to the New Testament when Jesus speaks about God in the 4th chapter of the Gospel of St. John. Jesus says, God is spirit and must be worshipped in spirit and in truth. The spirit is not confined to one location. It can move and be existent in all sorts of situations at the same time. God says that he must be worshipped in truth, the great I am. As we're thinking about that and beginning to move forward, one of the things that many theologians like to do, and certainly denominations of all sorts in the Christian faith, have developed doctrine, theological principles. They've developed creeds to state what they believe. But as we begin to think about, is God really something which we can describe? Is he beyond description? What we're doing with the creeds and with the doctrine is trying to put God into that square. We're trying to make God very defined so that we can say this is who God is. If we look at most of our descriptions of God, they're sort of categorized within kingdom language. Well, that's what the Israelites knew. That's what was going on in the early centuries of the church. There were kings and queens, leaders who had positions of high authority. Think about the language that we use, that Jesus sits at the right hand of God. Very much kingdom-oriented language. We're attempting to describe the indescribable. We're attempting to put God into this situation in which we cannot possibly do. We cannot say that God is this or that, because God is always becoming. It's as though he's like everything in the universe, still becoming whatever it is that God is. Doctrines, creeds can also become idols for us. We become so fascinated with them, so fixated upon them, that they become the focal point of our worship, not upon God, the great I am. As we look for names for God, maybe as we're eliminating using the name God, we could use the Divine One, the Holy One, the Creator God, the great I am. Any of those would probably be much more reflective than simply the way the term God now is being used. As we journey along on our own spiritual journeys, let us think carefully about this question. Is God beyond description? What can I know about God? Is there a God? Maybe the point of this is that our role is not to describe God, to delineate God, to ascribe characteristics to God, but to pray that the Holy One, the great I am, will enable me to have relationship with him, to love him, to follow him, to serve others, to love others. Well, that is our journey. Serving others and loving others is the primary message of Jesus to each one of us. And so to love God is to serve others. To know God is to love others. As you journey along, may you indeed know the great I am. Have relationship with the great I Am. Love Him, follow Him, and serve and love others. May you be filled with grace, peace, love, joy, hope, and mercy on your spiritual journey. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.